Welcome to this conversation on microaggressions and unconscious bias. We're going to spend a little time talking about the relationship between those two concepts because a lot of times people get those things confused or they wonder how is it that unconscious bias and microaggressions are connected. And to do that, I want to kind of paint a picture for you. All right. So first, my name is Koen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. And when we think about this notion of unconscious bias, I want you to think about this notion of a cup. And I want to tell you a brief story. When I was younger, I had a Honda Civic. It was an 84 Honda Civic standard transmission that did not have a cup holder. And so oftentimes I'd be running late for work. And so I just grab a cup of coffee, hop in my car, and with the standard transmission, you had to use both hands and both feet to operate the vehicle. And consequently, my coffee would spill as I'm doing all of the things that I'm doing. And oftentimes when I use this illustration in classes or in presentations that I do, I ask the follow-up questions, right? Like, why do you think that the coffee spilled? And oftentimes people will tell me, well, you were in a hurry. They will tell me that I didn't have a cup holder. They'll say that my cup was inadequate for the task that was at hand, right? That I should have had a better container, right? And all of those things may in fact be very true, that those things should have or could have helped me not to spill. But for me, it became really important to recognize what was in the cup. Right. And so coffee was spilling because that's what was in the cup. And given my circumstances, given my situation, given what I was attempting to do with the resources that I had, no matter what it was that was in the cup, it was going to spill out. Right. So if water was in the cup, it would have spilled out. Juice was in the cup, it was going to spill out. And so that really got me to thinking about what is the importance of knowing what is in your cup. And so when we talk about this idea of unconscious bias, we talk about microaggressions and their relationships, what I want us to understand is that unconscious bias are those things that we accumulate, those learnings that we get from the people around us, the contexts that we're growing up in, the communities in which we develop, and those things become subconscious. Those aren't things that we're thinking about on a regular basis. So those are the things that we put in our cup, and sometimes those things that we put in our cup spill out, and they spill out in the forms of microaggressions, right? So so microaggressions are those things that spill out. Now we can call them a number of other things, and we'll get to that in other sessions. But we're going to talk specifically about the relationship between unconscious bias and these microaggressions. And these microaggressions are really designed to enforce the otherness of the individuals that don't come from my group, right, or who don't share my ideology or my philosophical underpinnings, right? So we use microaggressions to create this thing called othering, and we'll spend a little more time with that in just a little bit. But oftentimes what I'll hear people say, well, I didn't intend to do that thing, right? And so what I'd like for us to kind of think about is the idea that oftentimes our intentions may not be aligned with our behaviors. And when our intentions are not aligned with our behaviors, we end up with this developmental gap, right? Which begs us, those of us who are thinking, those of us who want to be effective in what we do, to pay attention to that gap, right? To close that gap between our intentions and our behaviors so that they actually become one in a sense, right? And so sometimes you'll hear people say, well, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't intend to do that. For example, the example that I like to use are these nuts, right? And so in my family, we have referred to these as Brazil nuts. And other folks in their families, they've called them other things, right? Like the N-word toes, that negative word for Black people that people use, the N-word toes. And so when we think about this notion, is that do people who use that, were they attempting to bridge differences and commonalities, make a bridge, or were they actually trying to divide people, right? And so oftentimes when we think about these microaggressions, they create or they exacerbate this notion of othering, right? So you speak really well for dot 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 dot, right? Now, is that trying to gather people together, or is that trying to accentuate our differences or create this othering, right? Um, you know, you know, oh, you're the doctor, right? Is that question really designed to bring us together, or is that to remind folks that there is another? You speak really well coming from dot dot dot, right? So again, this notion of othering. So how do we overcome these othering behaviors? How do we address our microaggressions? We do that through the alignment of our behaviors, our goals, our values, and our intentions, right? So we align those things. So we align our intentions with our values, our goals, and our behavior. And we do that so that when I behave, it is congruent with what my goals are, right? What my intentions are, what my values are. That's how we undermine unconscious bias as well as microaggressions, which are those things that create those opportunities for othering. And so when I'm aligned, I'm really able to use this tool of cognition to recognize how to gain cognitive control over my unconscious bias, over my microaggressions, so that I'm not creating others or I'm doing this othering thing when that's not my intention, right? And so that becomes important. And once we're able to get to this cognitive control place, then we are able to recognize the difference between fault and responsibility, right? And so although we have unconscious bias, although we may be engaging in microaggressions, they may not be our fault, but they are our responsibility, right? And so when we come to the age of accountability, we will be held accountable, right? We will look to be effective, and the general public may not necessarily find these things useful, but when people look to us as leaders, we must demonstrate leadership by recognizing that we have control over our unconscious bias and our microaggressions as we align those things with our goals, our values, our intentions, and our behaviors. And so I want to say thank you so much for your time in this particular section. We'll talk more in other sessions, but I look forward to seeing who you become as we continue these conversations, and we will see you later.